Do I need to hit start on here, Margaret? There's a continue practice. Okay. All righty. Yeah, I know. Thanks for the reminder. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to everybody in the room and also who's joining us online to the Great Lakes Seminar Series, co-sponsored by the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research and the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. My name is Greg Dick. I'm the director of SGLR, and really thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Allison Steiner. So Allison is a professor in CLASP, Climate and Space Sciences and Engineering at the University of Michigan, where she leads a research group that studies the interactions between the biosphere and the atmosphere to understand how vegetation affects atmospheric chemistry and climate. But she's also doing a lot on interactions between Great Lakes and the atmosphere, and that's what we're gonna hear about today. So Allison got her undergrad in chemical engineering at Johns Hopkins, did a PhD at UC Berkeley, and then came to the University of Michigan in 2006. She's won a number of major awards, including an NSF Career Award, AGU's Atmospheric Sciences Ascent Award, and the Harold R. Johnson Diversity and Service Award from the University of Michigan. I'm also always amazed when I look at Allison's CV at the contributions she makes to the university and her department in terms of service, and also to her profession in terms of service. So she, as an example, a couple of examples, she's the president of the Atmospheric Sciences section at AGU, and I know she's also put a lot of work into a National Academy of Sciences board on atmospheric sciences, so she serves as a member on that board. So we're thrilled that Allison is here and also a part of our newly funded Great Lakes Center for Fresh Waters and Human Health. So we're starting to interact with her in the lab down here at SGLR and GLRL. And today we're going to hear a talk on climate chemistry in the Great Lakes. What goes up must come down. Please join me in welcoming Allison.
Thanks, Greg, for the introduction. The only thing is I actually did my PhD at Georgia Tech, which Elisa and I were talking about this morning. We missed each other by a few years there. I did a postdoc at Berkeley before coming to Michigan. Thanks so much for having me this morning. It's really nice to be here in person. I think we had tried to schedule this seminar about 3 years ago, and then I got COVID, and then it was doing virtual, and I didn't want to do virtual because I really prefer to be in person at this point. Too many online seminars and COVID. So it's really great to be here today, and it's been nice to meet with a lot of people this morning and see what's been going on down here at GLRL and then SGLR. So I kind of put together a couple different things. This is like, I would say this talk is a little bit more like on the survey side of things to give you an idea of things we worked on in my research group at Michigan over the years. And I'd just like to start off by thanking some like collaborators and funding agencies that have funded this over the years. So today I'll talk about some work by a former PhD student of mine, Summer Minala, and also an undergraduate, Lunia Oriol. A postdoc, Anahita Amiri Farahani. She was a SGLR postdoc in 2020 and 2021. And then I've worked a lot with a lot of different people at U of M. You might recognize many names here. And today I'll talk about work that's done with Andy Alt in chemistry and Mary Lynham, and she's in the School of Public Health. And we've had support on this from the National Science Foundation, from NOAA, and also some internal money at the University of Michigan. Because I do lots of different things in my research group, and some of that is just how your research evolves over time. So I actually have two parts to today's talk. I'm going to start first on the climate side of things and talking about what atmospheric processes are driving precipitation in the Great Lakes region. And then the second part, I'll move to the chemistry part of things and talk about lakes as a source or a sink for aerosols, and a little bit about their impact on climate and other Great Lakes processes. So from the climate perspective, I started getting into this work from these are the classic CAVS pictures that most of you are familiar with some images of cyanobacteria blooms in Lake Erie and the microcystis bacteria that can produce different toxins. And on the lower left-hand, I'm showing sorry, oops, that's not the right picture. That's obviously Lake Erie in the lower left-hand corner. And so, we started, when I first came to Michigan, there was some interest in trying to understand how climate was influencing halves. And we were looking at this predominantly from the lens of precipitation. So, there had been a lot of work done on temperature. And so we were trying to understand this factor of precipitation and how changes in precipitation might be influencing runoff, which would change nutrient loads. And so we really didn't have a good understanding of that at the time. So this was originally as part of an NSF project on water, sustainability, and climate that had quite a few people across U of M and also from GLERL at the time. And so one of the reasons we were interested in this is more recent data from the last National Climate Assessment, looking at how precipitation has changed over the region. So this is showing you present day precipitation change. And you can see when we look at the Great Lakes region, with a few exceptions in the Upper Peninsula, most of the observed precipitation from the present day to earlier in the century shows a lot of an increase of about 15%. So as we have these, this is the overall average in precipitation. And when we look at the projections, trying to understand what climate models would be projecting, this is showing you projections from CMIP6 for the winter on the left and the summer on the right. You can see my cursor, yes. And then just on the bottom, this is the number of models that show that agreement. You can see that the winters are generally projected by end of century to be wetter. And the summers, you see a kind of a mixed bag across the Great Lakes with a lot more model disagreement. So generally, most of the models are agreeing that the winters are getting wetter. But in the summer, we often see some summer drying in the model projections as well. And so what we were initially starting to look at was trying to understand what the climate models were predicting for precipitation changes in the Great Lakes. First, looking at how models are simulating the historical period over the region, and then also trying to understand what are the drivers for that increase in future precipitation. So we started off with the first part, trying to understand how models are simulating the historical time period. And to do that, we started off looking at some atmospheric reanalyses. So I think, for those of you who aren't atmospheric scientists in the room, atmospheric reanalysis is a combination of model data with observations to provide like a globally consistent and complete data set. So it's going to fill in those gaps in space and time and do it in a very consistent way over multiple decades and also over space. So this is just an example from the ECMWF model where we might have different aspects of global observations, and those are assimilated into a three-dimensional global model, and that allows us to recreate our kind of our best representation of what the atmosphere looked like over time. The one thing to note about this is that when they assimilate observations, most of the global reanalyses actually don't assimilate precipitation. They're still simulating it in the way that a global climate model would. But we also have a lot better constraints in terms of changes in temperature, vertically in the atmosphere, moisture and winds. So we think that this is probably still a pretty good representation. So we actually started with the reanalysis because then we can look at different components of the moisture budget and try to use that to understand what's happening in terms of how the reanalysis is simulating precipitation. And so we did this with a couple different products. So we used ERA Interim. ERA is the European Center for Mid-Range Weather Forecasting. Their older product, ERA 5, which is their newer product. One from NASA known as MERA 2, one from NCEP, and then also we did, the fifth one was the North American Regional Reanalysis, which is a little bit higher resolution and is just over North America. And then we also compared that with 3 observational products or gridded observations. So in this case, it's not being blended with models. And we can evaluate a couple different components of the moisture budget with that. So when we look at these 8 different products together over the Great Lakes region, and so now I'm defining this as 40 to 50 north and 75 to 95 west, approximately. So you can see this is the seasonal cycle averaged over the historical time period. And so one of the things you can see, so the dashed lines are these 3 different gridded products. So what we think is like kind of our best representation based on surface observations. And so you can see, we see that lower precipitation in the winter, increasing through the spring. In the more recent times, we're getting a little bit of a midsummer drying there before the precipitation comes back up and then decreases into the fall. So the 5 different colored lines here are the different reanalyses products. And so you can see that most of them are capturing, or 3 of the 5, barely most, are capturing that general seasonal cycle fairly well. The ERA interim and the ERA 5 look pretty similar, and the NAR is a little bit lower than the other products, but it's still getting that seasonal cycle. And there are two that are actually very different. So the MERA actually shows a much larger precipitation peak in the spring. And the CFSR actually does this strange sort of bimodal representation of precipitation. Both of these are leading to a lot of summer wetting. And so one of the reasons we got interested in this is because you actually see this pattern in a lot of the global climate models, as I'll show in a couple of slides. And so one of the ideas was like, okay, what can we learn from the reanalysis that would help us understand why the models might be behaving this way as well? That was our naive question going into it. As you see, it'll get a lot more complicated. So looking at the observed precipitation, this is the CRU gridded observation products. And you can kind of see that, like, you know, when we look at the April, May, and the June, July, we have, like, you know, a little bit more north-south gradients in the precipitation with larger values to the north. And then once we get to the other seasons, we see more of this east-west gradient. So when we look at and compare that with the four different reanalysis products, in that case, you can see that, like, in general, we're kind of capturing a lot of that, but you can see some of them here. You can see in that MERA product and the CFSR product, these much wetter springs that we're getting from there. And that's happening predominantly in the southern half to the south of the Great Lakes. That's where we see that greater wetting. So where is that moisture coming from? This is one of the reasons why we wanted to use the reanalysis, was because we can actually dig a little bit more into the processes. And again, this should be, like, in many cases, they're tied to observations a bit more than a global climate model would be, to try to understand if we can see where the model may be getting these biases. So with that, we used a moisture budget equation here. And so generally, there's a couple components to this. So we have our change in precipitable water, which is the first integral. We have the vertically integrated moisture flux divergence, which would be that moisture flux coming in and out of our box. We have evaporation and precipitation. And then we also have another residual term. So if you think about this moisture budget, like, on long time scales globally, our evaporation and precipitation should be balancing each other out. Okay. As we move to shorter time scales, this atmospheric storage term becomes more important. Okay. And as we move to smaller regions, then we have to think about the moisture flux that might be coming in and out of our box. So again, like, if we're thinking purely global, the evaporation and precipitation should balance, but as we move down in scale, these other terms might be more important. The residual term is the last term, and that actually comes from a variety of errors, which it's really an artificial term. It doesn't really lack any physical meaning, but we can't ignore it because it's going to affect the overall budget. And usually this comes into the fact that we might be assimilating different observations in these products, and they may be introducing other errors into the moisture budget as well. So when we look at these terms individually, this can help us understand a little bit about the seasonal cycle of precipitation. So here's the first term, the evaporation. So here I'm showing you the 5 different reanalysis products. And in general, you can see, you know, not surprisingly, we see this peak within the summer and lower evapotranspiration values in the winter. And there's, you know, quite a bit of variability within the products reanalysis because they're all using their own land surface model to come up with this evaporation rate. When we look at the moisture flux divergence, so this is showing you the integrated, so over the entire column, moisture flux over time. So when it's greater than 0, it indicates divergence, which means that we have moisture moving out of the box. And when it's less than 0, we have convergence, which means we're bringing moisture into the box. And that's that Great Lake box there. So generally what we see is we see divergence within the summer and convergence in all of our other seasons. And, you know, again, looking at the differences between the reanalysis products, we see most of that difference happening within the summer. And again, the MERA and the CFSR product, those ones that were showing those kind of strange seasonal cycles, show a lot more divergence and a lot more convergence. So that amplitude is actually a little bit larger with those two products. And finally, the other terms are relatively smaller. Our storage of precipitable water is like an order of magnitude less than the divergence and convergence and the evaporation I just showed. And they all kind of look pretty similar. So that storage term is very similar. With the residual, the magnitude gets a little bit larger and you can see quite a bit of variability. And again, because the reanalyses are assimilating observations, they might not always be complying with a total conservation of mass energy when we look at this over these smaller scales. And that's where we get this additional term from. So then that kind of comes to this question of, when we look at the moisture budget components, this balance of these different sources is really what's driving the precipitation in the model. And again, all these products, except for the NAR, are simulating their own precipitation via a microphysics scheme and also convective parameterization scheme in the same way that a climate model or a weather prediction model would be doing. So I just wanted to highlight sort of when we look at these budget terms, which are shown in the different colors here. So here's the moisture budget equation again. And we can kind of think of that evaporation and the moisture flux terms together as like sources, right? They're both providing a source of moisture to the atmosphere. And so when we add them, so the evaporation is shown in yellow for April for the 5 different products, and the vertically integrated moisture flux is shown in green, again, for the different products. So when we look at the April, right, the evaporation is generally higher than the moisture flux, but together the moisture flux is still contributing to this total source term, which is represented by the stippled bar. As we go into June, now we can see that vertically moisture flux is very, very small, and we actually end up having evaporation. Again, we can think back to that seasonal cycle peak, and most of that is going towards the precipitation. So one of the things we can kind of take away from looking at these historical reanalyses products is that one, it's important to remember that they're never going to give you a great representation of precipitation, but some of the products have much higher biases than others. And again, like I think most people who work with reanalysis are aware of this product, but might not be aware of how different they can look. And that balance, or where we think some of these differences are coming from, it really comes down to both that evaporation product as well as the moisture flux that's coming in and out. You can see that no one is like, you can't really point the finger at one thing being wrong for MERA or for the NCEP, but that sort of looking at them together kind of gives us an idea that when we have that, they can really amplify or dampen the available moisture that's available for precipitation. So this gives us a little idea of how we can think about moisture in and out of the Great Lakes region. But what we were really going with this was trying to understand what the global climate models were doing and what might be happening in a future scenario. So in this case, we're using data from the CMIP6 archive, or the Climate Model Intercomparison Project version 6, and we use data from the SSP 245 scenario, which is sort of this middle of the road kind of pathway, which is shown in the blue line right here. So here is our historical observations, and then as we project out, we were looking at mid-century changes that might be happening to precipitation. We also looked at some other scenarios. Sometimes I was just talking about this with Abby, like we often might look at the 585 as our super warming scenario, where the world is going to be 6 degrees warmer. Some people think that that's unrealistic, although the jury's still out on that. Hopefully we're not going to get to that case, but the 245 kind of represents a middle of the road. So what do the models look like in terms of the CMIP? So the left-hand side is showing you the historical from 81 to 2010 for the CMIP models, and the right is showing you the mid-century projection. So those same observations I showed before are the dotted lines are the crew observations, and the dashed line is the ERA interim observations, which are the ones that kind of best represent the seasonal cycle of those 5 reanalyses products that we looked at before. So those 2 black dotted lines are giving you like what our ground truth is on the historical. And then all of these colored lines are showing you the different CMIP6 projections. And if you've looked at CMIP6 data, sometimes when I show this to students, they're horrified at how bad the models do in the historical. But in fact, this is like a well-known thing that we all know. Like when you start working with climate model data, we know that these biases exist, and we know that there can be a huge model spread, especially for precipitation. It's just a really challenging variable to get right in both space and time. So you can see that some of these models are getting that seasonal cycle fairly well. Others are doing really strange things, like really underestimating precipitation. And a lot of them, I would say, like one of the common things that stick out is we have a lot of models in the historical that are very wet in the spring. Okay, and again, this is why we were kind of looking at this from the reanalysis perspective. And in the mid-century, you can kind of eyeball it and see like, yep, our spring precipitation is going up a little bit. Some of the models are showing a little bit more of that midsummer drying that I mentioned, which seems like that might be becoming a little bit more common. There is also this very strong wet bias in the spring and the winter. But in general, one of the things that we can see is that in the future, the winter-spring version is almost always wetter, and the July-August generally tend to be drier. And just one other minor point, if you're interested in that midsummer drying from the Great Lakes perspective, one of the things that we observed is that even if the model wasn't historically dry in the summer, the future was projecting drier, even in models that didn't show a midsummer drying period in the historical. So it kind of suggests that this midsummer drying might evolve to be something that's more important in the region. And then we can look at the changes in these different components of the moisture fluxes. So I'm going to start with, this is actually an easier way to see what I was just sort of talking about. So this is a panel of monthly precipitation and the different models along the top. So I'm keeping the historical on the left. And so if the values are blue, it means that precipitation is increasing in the model. And if the values are red, it means that they're decreasing. So this is actually an easier way of seeing, like, again, most of the models are wetter in the spring and winter, and then you start to see this drying signal appear pretty strongly in the future. We can also look at this with respect to the evaporation. So the historical, again, is shown on the left. The reanalysis is shown in the dashed line. And again, a fairly wide model spread that's coming from all of them having different land surface models, potentially different treatment of lake surfaces, or maybe in some cases no lakes at all in some of these models. So you get a really large spread. And in the future, you start to see an increase there. So when we look at this sort of, again, this heat map plot of the different models by month, you can see that generally mostly things are blue, which means that the evaporation is increasing, and we see that summer evaporation increasing more. And then the third component that I'd like to show is the moisture flux convergence. So here's our historical on the left, and again, what the reanalysis is showing, which is showing, sorry, and then one thing, this is flipped. So before I showed divergence on the top and convergence on the bottom, so sorry about that. So again, like we have a lot of divergence in the summer and convergence of moisture in the winter. Reanalysis, again, is the solid dashed line. And here you can see the model spread. So when we look out to the future, you can kind of visually see it, that amplitude of that spread between the moisture flux divergence is increasing. We're seeing, more convergence in the winter, more divergence in the summer. And if we look at the magnitude difference, you can see that again here. So especially in the summertime, we're seeing this strengthening in the amplitude, and as well as stronger winter convergence and stronger summer divergence. And the stronger winter convergence would generally lead to more precipitation, and the greater summer divergence would lead to less precipitation. So the last one I want to note is that this is where the what goes up, what comes down. So the other thing you can often do with the models is you can look at this concept of precipitation recycling. So precipitation recycling is quantified as the evaporation over the total incoming moisture source. So it would be your evaporation plus your influx of moisture convergence. So it's giving you this idea of how much of the precipitation is based on what would be local, which would be evaporation, versus what might be non-local, which would be what you're advecting in your boundaries. And when we look at the historical recycling ratios, you can generally see from the analysis, we're peaking in the summer at around 10 to 12%, meaning that about 10 to 12% of the precipitation produced within that model domain is being driven by the local or evaporative process. Okay. When we go out to the future, one of the things that we can see is that the recycling ratio is increasing in the winter and generally decreasing into the summer and the fall. So again, even though you have more evaporation, potentially, we have to think about that balance of what you have that's being advected out of the domain. And one of the things that we saw in the summer was there was a strong divergence that increases. So even though we have more evaporation, we have more divergence, and overall that leads to a reduction in the recycling ratio. So just to kind of interpret some of these future changes for what that means is that the models are dominantly showing this drier summer and wetter winters and springs, and a slight shift in that seasonal maxima as well. That increased moisture inflow and evaporation is driving a lot of that winter and spring increase in the precipitation. And again, this summer, what we see as that drying is that we see a slight reduction in that recycling ratio. So again, even though there's more evaporation that's coming off of the surface, it doesn't always translate into more precipitation because it's being balanced by what's being advected out of the region. So this, I should just say, this work, these were two different papers that were published by a former graduate student of mine, Summer Manala. She's now working at NCAR. And she also did a third paper. Once we started looking at the ERA 5 data, we noticed a lot of really unusual things about how ERA 5 was treating the lakes differently than ERA interim. And so I always kind of usually I have a sort of just kind of put that out there for those of you who are interested in using it over the lakes. I can talk more a little bit about that later. But I wanted to use the second half of my talk to switch gears a little bit and talk about the aerosol component and the atmospheric chemistry. And so, a lot of times in my group, we might have some students working on climate projects like the two papers I just described. And then I also have quite a few students who are looking at aerosols, and we've started looking at many more different kinds of unusual aerosols and how they can interact with clouds and influence regional climate. So I want to talk about the chemistry part in two sort of Great Lakes relevant parts. The first one is what goes up and talking about the Great Lakes as an aerosol source through lake spray aerosol. And the second part is what comes down and how different types of aerosols can be depositing to the surface either through wet or dry deposition, and the Great Lakes can be acting as an aerosol sink. And to tie it back in with the HABs theme, I'll talk about how aerosol phosphorus can be deposited to the Great Lakes and what that might, the implications of that for the overall phosphorus budget. So I want to start off with the lake spray aerosol, or the what goes up. So I think like most climate people are aware of like the concept of sea spray aerosol, and the same thing can be translated to the lakes, and we can have what's known as lake spray aerosol. So generally what happens for the formation of sea spray aerosol is as we have waves crashing and waves breaking, they're entraining air into the water itself, and that will create these bubbles below the surface. These bubbles of air are then rising to the surface and they pop, and as they rise and eject, then they're releasing all these sort of little droplets and tiny particles that are then creating what we call sea spray aerosol. If there are, like in this figure, they're showing there's a microlayer there, and so if these bubbles are rising through films on the surface, or as I'll get into, like harmful algal blooms, right, they could be taking up some organic enriched water with them and bringing some of that organic material with it. So the interesting thing, so I've been working on this with a colleague of mine, Andy Alt, who's a professor in chemistry, and he had worked on sea spray aerosol as part of his PhD. And when he came to Michigan, he started getting interested in lake spray aerosol. And it's kind of interesting because this process, how we might generate aerosol from water is very similar between the ocean and a lake. But the difference is the water is a very different composition between seawater and freshwater. And so Andy has done work in the lab. This is a paper from his group by Nate May that looked at the differences between sea spray aerosol, or SSA, and lake spray aerosol, LSA. And so here are some just different images of what, and when they say synthetic seawater, they were testing in the lab. So like they make a seawater based on sodium chloride. They have synthetic freshwater where our predominant ions are calcium carbonate. And then they also actually tested some actual Lake Michigan freshwater. And so this is showing you conductivity versus concentration. And seawater generally tends to have a very, very high ionic content because it's predominantly sodium. There's a little bit of magnesium and potassium and a lot of chlorine. So our sort of typical seawater profile has a very different ionic composition than freshwater. And so a lot of the ions that are present within the freshwater here have a lower ionic content, a higher organic content, and that can influence the types and sizes of bubbles. And so what Andy's work showed that they can actually see relatively different size distributions between lake spray aerosol and sea spray aerosol. So here with sea spray aerosol, you can see there's definitely a lot more of it. It's emitted in greater magnitude than the lake spray aerosol, but you can also see that you kind of have these two different components to the size distribution. So sorry, I should have said that on the x-axis is the aerosol particle size in nanometer, and then the concentration is on the y-axis in log units. And so again, a larger curve means you're emitting more, a higher number concentration, and then the x-axis is telling you what size is there. And so the sizes look pretty different between lake spray aerosol and the sea spray aerosol. It also, we can see, again, this different composition. And so generally, these carbonates and organics that are present in the lake spray aerosol, they also contain a lot of calcium, a lot of carbonates. And again, this ionic difference can create different kinds of ways that bubbles can pop, and generally produces these slightly larger bubbles from lake spray aerosol. And so this is something that we wanted to try to include in the model. And so in my research group, we've been predominantly, for when we do aerosol climate interactions, we're using WRF Chem, which is a chemistry version of WRF, where you're simulating the chemistry online within, you're sort of interleaving your chemistry and meteorological model time steps. And we can do both gas phase chemistry, and then we can also do aerosol phase chemistry. And so basically, we kind of tried to model lake spray aerosol in the same way that we would model sea spray aerosol, which it usually is dependent on a wind height near winds near the surface. Generally, fluxes for sea spray aerosol are based on about 22 meters, because this is approximately the height of where a flux tower might be located on top of a ship that would be measuring fluxes of sea spray aerosol. So it's a little bit higher than what we see over land. And so we scaled that size distribution. So there are parameterizations that exist for sea spray aerosol that are a function of this wind at 22 meters. And so we scaled those, and we scaled the size distributions to match the laboratory observations for freshwater. And so in the model, we include 3 different size bins, which I'm showing you here. So ranging from nanometer scale up to about 10 microns. So the challenging thing about aerosols is there are many sizes. So we usually have to do log size bins to cover all these different sizes. And we used a chemistry model known as Mosaic. And we incorporated these laboratory measurements to include them in the model. Andy's group has also looked at the composition of these lake spray aerosol, and this is showing you the composition of the lake spray here on the right. So again, a lot of it is calcium, shown here in the red, and carbonate, shown in the blue. We do have a little bit of sodium, we do have a little bit of sulfate, like some other kind of ions, but like largely you can see that about 60% of that lake spray aerosol is calcium carbonate. So we can also specify those types of ions within the atmospheric model. And so this work on the modeling was done by a Sigler postdoc, Amiri Farahani, and I'll show you the results from her paper. The one thing that's important to note, this is where we're going to get a little bit of chemistry injected into here. The aerosol chemistry of lake spray aerosol is kind of interesting, because typically when we look at composition, so one thing that's shown here, if you notice, so I have the cations, positive ions, are shown in the warm colors, and the anions, the negative ions, are shown in the blue colors. And one thing that you can see is most aerosols tend to be acidic. Okay, they tend to have more negative charge than they do positive charge. And the interesting thing is, if we simulate aerosols over the Great Lakes region, we don't have a ton of positive sources, okay? In fact, one of the most common cations is ammonium. And ammonium chemistry is actually very complicated. You can have ammonium emitted from agricultural landscapes when it's applied as fertilizer. A lot of agricultural feedlots put out a lot of ammonium. And whether or not it goes into the gas or the aerosol phase really depends upon the chemistry of the aerosols. So one of the things that we did was, we had no lake spray aerosol, we had no sea spray, we had no aerosol coming off of the Great Lakes at all in these simulations ahead of time. So when we add the lake spray aerosol, one of the things that we're doing is we're adding this additional cation to the simulations. And it's interesting because that really changes a lot of the chemistry of what happens within the aerosol scheme. So generally what happens when you add a positive ion is it's going to want to form a salt. So it's going to want to find an anion to pair up with. And there's like an order of preferential treatment of how we form these salts. And so calcium salts tend to form first. And so that means that we actually were making a lot of more salted aerosol and changing the pH. The other interesting thing that can happen is that you can have heterogeneous reactions on the surface of this aerosol here. And so the interesting thing about calcium carbonate, which is a common component of a lot of our lake spray, is you can have reactions on the surface with nitric acid and sulfuric acid that will create different calcium salts and then release CO2. So it actually introduces, by adding the lake spray, in addition, we're changing the acidity of that aerosol and all the chemistry that happens as these these gases try to partition in and out of the aerosol. But then we're also having this potential for surface reactions. And nitric acid and sulfuric acid are really common byproducts of anthropogenic pollution. Those are the ones that when they go in the aqueous phase can come out as acid rain. And so they're really important for removing NOx and SOx, which are 2 big pollutants from the system. So one of the things that can happen is it's actually converting some of those gas phase species into aerosol species, which can then stick around in the atmosphere a lot longer. So that may have been more chemistry than you wanted, but hopefully I made it such that it's at least slightly interesting. So then we did WRF-Chem simulations. We did 1 month in 2015, and we picked November because it's actually the windiest month. So this is our largest proportion for generating a lot of lake spray aerosol. This shows the simulated 22-meter wind speed and direction. We did a relatively larger domain, and then most of the analysis I'll talk about is focused on the Great Lakes component. So on the right here is showing you the wind-generated aerosol number flux of lake spray aerosol, and you can see so essentially this is just going to match the wind speeds. So wherever we have higher wind speeds, we're generating more of this lake spray aerosol. And the interesting thing was, we're still looking into actually the cloud feedback part. This is something that I have a current graduate student working on, but we got really interested in what happens with the chemistry, because we have a lot of stuff going on in the Great Lakes in terms of chemistry. So when we add this additional lake spray, it changes the pH quite a bit, because you're changing how nitrate is moving in and out of this gas phase, okay? So we saw a large increase in the aerosol nitrate, and we saw a decrease in the aerosol ammonia. So I said, ammonium is one of these common cations because there aren't many around. So when we added all this extra calcium in, the ammonium didn't want to partition into the aerosol phase as much, so its concentrations went down, but we could see a big increase in the aerosol nitrate. And those surface reactions then also led to an overall decrease in the nitric acid. And again, nitric acid is a component of acid rain, and it's also considered something we're concerned about when we have regions of pollution. We also saw a large decrease in the aerosol pH, which again influences how all these different types of gases are partitioning in and out of the particle. So in terms of next step from that, so that work was published and we talked about the chemistry. In terms of next steps, I have a graduate student working with me right now who's going to continue this work on the lake spray aerosol. And the question for the center that Greg mentioned that he's leading, we're one of the projects that is trying to understand how the harmful algal blooms may be aerosolized. So I didn't really talk a lot about the organic content, but I mentioned it with the bubble bursting. So there's a possibility that a lot of that organic content can be aerosolized as we have this wave breaking action. And there's recent preliminary work that suggests that the toxins are coming along with it. And so this has this implication, if we are aerosolizing a lot of the organic matter and the toxins, then this also represents a completely different exposure pathway for HABs than we might have been considering, because it might be that we're breathing in a lot of these toxins if you're near a bloom. And in fact, I've heard from marina operators, they sort of talk about the August cough that they have. We know that a lot of the gases and potentially aerosols are emitting, they could just be an irritant, or they also could be causing these toxins that have these other health impacts, which is something, and obviously ALS is a really devastating disease, and trying to understand causes is really important. So that's kind of one direction that we're going in. The last thing I wanted to mention, just because I think this might be of interest to many here at Clairol, is this idea about HAB mitigation. So I talked about, a lot of the work we did on the moisture flux and understanding precipitation changes was framed around how is precipitation changing and how will that change runoff and nutrient delivery in the Great Lakes. And as we were working on this project, the aerosol person in me was starting to wonder about, there are other sources of phosphorus. Runoff is clearly the dominant one that's driving HABs. But one thing we don't have a good handle on is how much might be coming from the atmosphere. And so it got us starting to think about what are some atmospheric sources of phosphorus and how could we try to quantify that. So this is part of the what comes down. So, phosphorus can end up in atmospheric aerosol in a couple different ways. It can be a large component of biomass burning. So a lot of phosphorus is resolving in woody plants, and so when those burn, they end up in biomass burning aerosol. It also can be in soil dust, depending upon the source of origin. And I show this figure because this was a really famous paper where biomass burning and Sahara dust transport of phosphorus has been attributed for fertilizing the Amazon in one example. Also, industrial processes can lead to phosphorus, especially fertilizer production, and also bioaerosols. I do a lot of work with pollen. They also can contain phosphorus too, and we don't really have a great idea of how these are contributing to phosphorus and aerosol mass. From the perspective of looking at the total loads, this is from sort of a gray literature paper about trying to assess, this is one of the only really studies where I've seen where they've tried to assess in the Great Lakes how much phosphorus is coming from the atmosphere. And so in this figure, obviously the point sources in red or the non-point in green are huge sources, and we're talking, thousands of metric tons. The atmospheric deposition component in blue is this tiny little slice of the pie. But we don't have great, but I've been unable to find good literature ways of how people have estimated this. And also we could imagine if we have sources like dust or biomass burning, we would see a lot of interannual variability in these sources as well. And this is something that we wanted to try to start to explore. So it's actually hard to find composition data for aerosols. We measure aerosol, the EPA measures aerosol PM2.5 and PM10 relating to the size of the particles, but composition is actually very hard to come by. But there is one network that measures composition, and it's a network called IMPROVE, and it's actually run, the EPA manages it for the National Park Service, and it came out of this idea of visibility in national parks was decreasing in the 80s, and so people would go to the national park and say, I can't see to the other side of the Grand Canyon. And so this whole visibility project about what's in the aerosol and how we can monitor over time has actually led to one of our longer term records of aerosol composition. So if we look at these Great Lakes, like sort of Great Lakes upwind sites, I'll call them, these are different stations, improved stations in a couple different regions. So here I'm kind of calling these our boundary water stations. Here I'm calling these the Central Great Plains region, and here we have a few in the Ohio River Valley. And so we can look at this data. So this is average from 2013 to 2020. This is the phosphorus composition. So these are in nanograms per meter cubed. It's small. There's not a lot of phosphorus in these particles. Okay. Now IMPROVE just measures these tiny particles, PM2.5. Okay. Usually when we report PM2.5, it's usually in micrograms. So the phosphorus composition that they're measuring is relatively small. However, over all three of these regions, you can see a seasonal cycle. So we generally tend to see higher phosphorus concentrations in the summer and lower phosphorus concentrations in the winter. So what we wanted to try to do was try to come up with estimates of wet and dry deposition to try to understand what might be deposited to the Great Lakes. So here on the left, I'm showing you the PM2.5. So again, using those improved measurements, we can use those improved concentrations that I just showed, and we used an offline dry deposition model that was driven by reanalysis. Okay, so usually there's a couple factors in deposition, so wind speed matters, friction velocity, and you can come up with ways of parameterizing the deposition. So we use those concentrations and meteorological conditions to calculate the dry deposition of phosphorus. And here we're showing it for a couple different lakes, and there's some variability. So one thing I should note is that we used, for the boundary waters observations, we used that for Lake Superior. We used the Central Great Plains for deposition to Lakes Michigan and Huron, and then we use the Ohio River Valley for deposition to Erie and Ontario. So you'll often see our estimates clustered by those different lake systems, and that's because we're giving them different input concentrations from our limited upwind sampling of composition. So again, the interesting thing here is when we look at the deposition, it doesn't always follow the concentration profiles I just showed, but it actually is related more to the meteorological conditions. And in general, we see slightly more deposition in the sort of late summer to early fall. And occasionally this little spike here in Superior was due to the increase in concentrations that were observed. And again, we're dealing with some sparse data, so there could be some uncertainty there. In terms of wet deposition, so dry deposition is when the particles just settle by themselves. Wet deposition is when we come down in rain. And so there's a group of colleagues, Mary Lyman, who's in the School of Public Health. They had some historical wet deposition samples at the sites shown here down through Illinois, a few through Michigan, and one in the Upper Peninsula. And so they actually had collected rainwater samples at these sites over various years. And we went back and looked at that historical data to assess what the wet deposition of precipitation would be. And again, showing you this here, now we're looking at the wet deposition of phosphorus, which has more of a springtime peak, which again kind of correlates a little bit more with when we know we have more precipitation. So then we would expect more wet deposition. So we can use these numbers to actually come up with a total deposition estimate over the lakes. And so here's the estimate. So there's an older paper by Dolan and Chopra, which was from about 12 years ago, where they used, again, a small sampling of wet deposition measurements. And usually what they would do is they didn't have any dry deposition measurements. They just assumed that the wet and the dry were the same. So when you look at the black numbers here, so the first number is wet, this is wet, and this is dry, and this is total. So in the old estimates, the wet and dry are always the same. In our estimates, we used these revised precipitation samples that we had collected across Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan, along with our wet deposition estimates. And then the total is shown in the right. So again, these are metric tons per year. So you can see generally we're on the order of like, I don't know, a couple hundred to less than 1,000. Keep that in mind with what we know our metric tons from runoff is, when we have that from runoff, it's in the thousands to tens of thousands. So, as expected, this number is relatively small, but it gives us at least a slightly better constraint. So just a couple of ones I want to point out that are rather different. So these older estimates of the dry deposition of Superior are much larger than what we used when we calculated it from aerosol concentrations. We can also see a lot more wet deposition over Lake Michigan than these older studies, and then a lot less dry deposition over Erie and Ontario. So that allows us to kind of update some of these and get a sense of what that looks like, and provide some new constraints on this phosphorus deposition. So again, we know that this atmospheric piece is smaller, but it is still contributing. And there is one caveat to the numbers that I just showed. So we haven't included larger particles than PM2.5. So all of our estimates for dry deposition were based on PM2.5, these tiny particles. But in fact, there are several studies that show that there's actually much more phosphorus in larger particles, what we call PM10, which is something that the EPA measures. So we have number concentrations for PM10, but we don't have composition. And then finally, sometimes when you have events like biomass burning, or even when you have desert dust or agricultural dust events, you can get even larger particles up to 100 microns. Now, granted, they're typically not staying, 100 micron particle isn't going to last in the atmosphere as long as a 2.5 micron particle. However, under different convective conditions, we know that desert dust can be lofted to the higher altitudes when you have a lot of uplift or convective activity being transported long distances. And so Natalie Mahawal published a paper that was purely a modeling study that looked at, so here's our total deposition that we calculated from this study. Here are the Dolan and Chopper numbers. And when they included some of the larger PM100 measurements, you can see they can get, up to a factor of 3 higher than if we just think about the small particles. So one thing to kind of think about is we definitely know we need composition measurements on those larger particles to make a better estimate. So with that, I'll kind of just sum up with 2 different takeaways. So in the first part, I was talking about the climate perspectives and trying to understand precipitation variability. And again, we went into this with us trying to understand why winter and spring might be different in the future. And these process studies suggest that the atmospheric dynamics, that moisture convergence or divergence, together with the evaporation, is really what's driving that balance of precipitation change in the Great Lakes. And then the second part, this is something that we've been working on more and will continue to work on, is that the Great Lakes can be a regional source of aerosol, and adding these other positive ions from lake spray had an impact on the regional gas and aerosol phase chemistry in the simulations. And then on the flip side, they can also be a sink, and we looked at these particle, the phosphorus deposition and what that contribution is. So again, it's nothing like runoff, but it is still interesting to think about what we could be getting from the air. And with that, I'll just put up acknowledgements again, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, so we do have time for questions. If you're in the room, you just have to raise your hand. If you're online, I think you can type into the chat or the question box, and Margaret will read those questions. So the floor is open for questions. David's hands first.
Allison, it's always great to see Anna's work to be represented here. Going back to that, her simulations were mainly in sort of November, sort of this early cold season period. I'm particularly interested in sort of the stability of the near surface layer during these times, and what does that mean for your basically fate of anything that's lofted into the air? Would this considerably change maybe in a summertime where that stable layer in your surface is going to be much higher?
Yeah, and she didn't look at that in her paper, but that's something we've been thinking about from the interaction with cloud perspective, because a lot of these aerosols also could be good CCN. And so we've been trying to see if we can see a cloud impact. And so we actually started doing, I have a graduate student right now, and Anna ran the simulations, but didn't get time to look at them. We actually did a July case as well, because that's kind of when we were looking at clouds, and obviously in November, we have so much cloud that it doesn't really matter how much aerosol you add to the atmosphere, like the impact is so small. And so she's been looking at a July case also where we actually do see, you know, again, like a sort of marine layer cloud over the lakes and an upper layer cloud, and trying to look at the aerosol impacts in there. So it's in, I think it's in those simulations, and I do think it's influencing, like we are planning to do some side-by-side examinations of how, like what that means in terms of how the aerosol is circulated through the troposphere.
Sorry, when the lakes are acting as a source, how far do these aerosols carry?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if I have I showed the fluxes. And I also have like a concentration, but a concentration map. Wait, let me just see. Like it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. So like in general, like this, just to like, this is looking at the nitrate, which is one component, but generally we see like, you know, we can see influences of the aerosol on the land, like in Michigan. So we did some comparisons of like how the chemistry was changing over Lake Michigan and land. And you can see like when you go inland, you know, so it really depends on like how far they last in the atmosphere. It depends upon the size and also like the met conditions. If you have a lot of deep convection, they can get up high and be transported. But like this kind of gives you a fingerprint, you know, of how that region that's affected by those lake spray aerosol changes. So, you know, definitely between lakes, we can see a lot of influence. And so, you know, I would say that's sort of probably I'm not going to try to estimate that in kilometers in my head, but you can kind of see the footprint of the influence of the lake spray from there.
Thanks.
We'll go to James.
Really great talk. Just curious about the PM 2.5 and PM 10 monitoring. You mentioned the improved network, you know, the historical observations that you have or measurements that you have, but I guess for maybe the NIH work or, you know, kind of moving forward, are there some plans for improved measurements across the lakes that would help with, you know, being able to answer these questions that you're proposing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we should probably talk about that. Like I can bring that up with Andy. So I would say like improved tends to be focused on national parks, although they do have these other ones smattered around. There's a new network that's going up that's being funded by the National Science Foundation that's doing composition at a couple different locations. And basically like you can say you'll host a site to do these measurements. And so it is something I think like, you know, and one of my collaborator, Andy Alt, who's the PI of the project for the NIH study, it does a lot of aerosol composition. So, but the problem is like a lot of times people will measure it for a field season or something, it's not continuous. And so I think that's a good point, is thinking about like how we could get a longer term composition measurement going within Michigan. I think that would be really helpful. That's still always is with fine particles. Coarse particles are much harder to measure, and there's growing interest, I would say, in the atmospheric community. Everyone used to say the coarse ones don't matter, but there's growing interest in that, and doing composition on coarse is something else I would probably also advocate for.
Thanks. So I really like the concept of the recycled precipitation rate, if that's the right term, but I'm not sure I totally understand it, as will probably be evident in my questions. I'm like thinking of it as like the amount of precipitation that comes from sort of local sources. Is that sort of a reasonable way to?
I guess the thing about it is like, if you're looking like, you know, so we take like the Great Lakes region, we say, okay, this is the amount of precipitation we have. We're looking at the evaporation versus the evaporation from the inflow. So it's kind of like a source question, like where does moisture come from? It's either coming from the surface or you're bringing it in through divergence.
Right.
So when we do the recycling ratio, you're usually doing it. I mean, you could do it globally, right? Well, actually, globally, then you have no inflow, so you'd only have. So it wouldn't work globally. You have to do it kind of on a more constrained.
You always have 100%
region.
globally, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
They're equal. They're equal when it's global.
Okay.
You know, back to the you know, if you take out your time and space constraints, precipitation should equal evaporation. Like we can't create water. Right. But on a regional perspective, it's like looking at your two sources. Like how, you know, so which is evaporation and how much you're bringing in via moisture flux. And so it's looking at evaporation to evaporation plus influx of moisture.
So you threw out that totally makes sense. Thanks. You threw out that 10%. That can't mean that 10% of the precipitation is coming from local moisture sources.
That's what the recycling ratio says.
Really?
You know? So
Okay.
in general, like I'm trying to think, like in literature I haven't seen ever much of above 20 to 30%. But so like the idea is that, yes, so like it's saying 10% of that precipitation is purely local. Now that's averaged over the whole region. It's not to say that like, if you were to change your box so that like, if you did it, if you made your box purely over the lake, then that number might change too.
Right.
So it really is, it's a little bit of a tricky metric, I think, because it depends upon your boundaries and how you're setting up your region.
Okay, that makes sense. And then does it also account for moisture advected out of the region? Like it doesn't?
No, so it doesn't. So it's just purely, so it is like, it's a little bit of a, like you have to kind of separate what's going out versus what's coming in.
Sure.
So it's not looking at the overall budget. It's just saying like pure source.
Okay.
You know, it's either coming from evaporation or I'm advecting it in, and what is that ratio?
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, and so it kind of suggests, you can see that also in like when you look at the moisture flux divergence, like we have a lot of moisture moving in and out of the box. Ayumi's behind you, yeah.
Great talk. Thank you so much. I have a question about how WolfChem handles wave breaking and lake spray aerosol formation, like how much uncertainty exists there in that process?
I mean, so it doesn't actually simulate wave breaking, right? It's just using like a parameterized function based on the wind speed at 22 meters. And so it's pretty much like an exponential function up. And that's based on sea spray, which is saying that like based on observations, people have taken observations on a ship and calculated number concentration and then just plot it versus wind speed and come up with a relationship. So actually one of the criticisms we've got on this paper is that, well, you don't know that the lake spray is going to follow a sea spray parameterization. The only way to really rectify that is to go out and do flux measurements of particles. And so I was looking with great interest, of course, at the flux evaporation network that David and I were talking about that this morning, like trying to figure out if we could set up, you know, a particle counter with the eddy covariance that's there to try to come up with a true lake spray parameterization.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd be curious of your thought to think if you'd see more wave breaking over the Great Lakes or ocean. I'm thinking it would be less, but also the waves are so different that I don't know. I should ask you guys that question.
Different. There's no swell.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know how that would translate.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, that would be something that we could probably think about to maybe modify the parameterization like up or down, but yeah, it's still an open question.
One last question. I think that's it for the questions in the room. Anything online, Margaret? We'll do one more question online.
All right, we have in 2 of your slides, convergence is either negative or positive. I'm a bit confused and wanted to be sure which is the correct sign for convergence and divergence.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I flipped those. It was like a difference between 2 different papers. So I think like the one I feel most like, so generally here, in this case, we're using like a Green's theorem to calculate divergence. So in this case, divergence is positive and the convergence is negative. So that's kind of, I feel like the more standard way of describing it.
Okay. All right, well, we are out of time, so we'll stop there, but thanks again, everyone, for coming, and let's thank Allison one more time.